You can add your thoughts or any resources that you come up with or questions. And if you put your email at the end of the Google Doc, we will send it to you when we're all finished with some of our conclusions. Jessica and Lisa, am I leaving anything out?
No, I think you're good to go.
All right. So many of you will know what a focused free write is. You're going to take 3 minutes. You're not going to edit or self-censor. You're just going to write as you think. And this one is write about a teaching or educational development situation this past term that's caused you the greatest discomfort. I just want to warn you ahead of time that this is not going to be something that's shared. This is something, because we want this to be useful to you, it's something that you're going to reflect back on as we work our way through that process. So take about 3 minutes now, and we will practice our comfort with silence. Could you take a moment just to finish your sentence or finish your thought, please? All right. Well, as I said, we're not sharing this, you're not sharing this, but if there are insights or conclusions that you have about that exercise or thoughts that you have as you go along, do put them in the chat or put them on that Google Doc. And now our scenario. So part of the starting point for this session comes from the virtual cry in the wilderness that I sent off to poor Jessica and Lisa a few weeks ago, as I started to reconcile myself to the remote fall term. I've been on sabbatical. Technically, I'm still on sabbatical. So I didn't have that quick switch in March to look back to. I had a quick escape from a foreign country instead. Like so many of you, I'm in a position of trying to put all my courses in some remote format in September. And I've been trying to respond to directions and suggestions that are not always clear to me. And though I've been spending a lot of my time these days, pleasurably following teaching threads on Twitter and reading and attending webinars like this one, sitting through task force meetings and going to virtual conferences on about remote teaching, I still feel at sea. I still feel as if I have no safe, sensible harbor that I'm going to start out from. I think it was Lisa who talked about this a while ago, is trying to fit a full PhD's worth of research into 3 months. And that's okay. I like work. Work is good. And as we keep hearing, we're all in this together. It's some small consolation that there's a community out there all trying to figure this out at the same time. And I do recognize that I'm among the least precarious of my colleagues. I'm a tenured full professor with grown children, right? So my situation is considerably less difficult than many others. But I started to notice something particular about my state of mind. And this is what I sent off to poor Jessica and Lisa. Lisa, who apparently was dealing with 2 other people who were messaging her about exactly the same thing at exactly the same moment. In my career, I see myself as an adequate scholar and a decent administrator, but teaching is my thing. I've spent more than 3 decades developing that vocation, and part of my identity is fused both in the experience of the classroom and in helping other people to recognize their vocation in the classroom as well. When I give workshops, teaching workshops, I say very sensible things like, don't try to eat anything bigger than your head. In other words, don't make small changes in your teaching. Don't change everything at once. But by September, I need to have 4 online classes from 1st year to 4th year. And I've been telling others comforting things like, well, we're still in crisis mode. And we don't have to design perfect courses because that level of work is just not possible under these circumstances. But I don't actually seem to be comforting myself very much. A good enough doesn't feel like it's going to be good enough. All of a sudden, I'm incompetent. I'm purely incompetent at the thing I was supposed to be good at. And I'm gonna have a drink. It's just water so far. I'm more incompetent than I was when I started teaching, because then of course I thought I knew more. I was so much older then. I'm younger than that now. It's true, there are hopeful mornings when I think how wonderful this is. How much I'm going to learn, what a great opportunity this is to struggle. This is so exciting, it's a historic moment and we are living through it. Then almost the next minute, I'm in the depths of despair and checking my retirement package. Maybe I'm just done and maybe this is too hard. This is what I'm sure some of you have heard described as the COVID poster, right? And don't get me wrong, I know I'm going to fail and perhaps fail spectacularly. And one of the serious and difficult principles I talk to my students about all the time is the importance of learning and growing through failure. But in this case, I'm not afraid that I will fail myself. I'm deathly afraid that I'm going to fail my students, especially my new first-year students, when they most need me to know what I'm doing. When they're also most at sea, most in need of a North Star, most in need of a steady wind. I can't afford to be messy and unprepared and unsure. They don't need to watch me enjoy the learning that comes from screwing up their courses. In my first year classes, I spent a lot of time, not just with the material, which is early literature, but on adapting to university culture, on learning to learn, finding new strategies, maintaining a growth mindset, and generally figuring out how to figure out their own paths. I don't yet know how to do that for my students who may not even be in the province or time zone, who may not have good or even safe workspaces, who may themselves be dealing with financial pressures, illness, family stresses, anxiety, and depression, which are bad enough at the best of times, but will certainly be much worse through the pandemic. So to sum up, I'm almost 60, nearing the end of my career, suddenly afraid that I'm unable to do what I love or even be who I am. And I don't want to take a year's worth of 18 to 25-year-olds down with me. So there, we 3 agreed that I would present myself, my uncomfortable, obviously, identity crisis as the scenario here. Though many of you will have similar and even more serious worries, So now Lisa's going to walk us through a framework that might just help us make something of sense, something beyond just the chance to vent or rant out of that scenario that I just gave you. So Lisa, how do we get from to okay?
We get from screaming to okay. Well, and on that day that I was chatting with Shannon, and it was literally true that I had Shannon in one chat window, and I had 2 other people in 2 other chat windows, and I had my partner, who also teaches in the same program as I am, in the other room shouting things. And so that sort of started us thinking about this shared experience that we're having. And it takes a lot of courage to do what Shannon just did. So I really want to acknowledge that. And I was thinking about courage and like, where do you go when you need courage to teach? Well, you go to Parker Palmer, who has a book called Courage to Teach, which seemed like a no-brainer. And I was back with Parker Palmer, and back to this phrase that he comes back to over and over again in that book: naming, claiming, and aiming, which has its roots in, you know, sort of self-help entrepreneurial kind of domains, but that he sort of recuperated or claimed as a reflective practice. And I'm a chart person, I'm a flowchart person and a graph person. When I get stressed out, I need steps, because when I'm screaming, it's really hard for me to figure out how I'm going to get to a place where I'm not screaming. And if I can have some steps to follow, even if it's just a very loose framework, it at least gives me a way forward out of that space. So what I'm going to do now is just kind of walk through a sample framework that we can use to help us get from the scream to something else. So we're going to follow Parker Palmer through the idea of naming, claiming, and aiming. So this is a quotation from John Dewey. It's the first half of the quotation. We're going to come to the second half of it in a few minutes, where he says that the experience has to be formulated in order to be communicated. To formulate requires getting outside of it and seeing it as another would see it. And so this notion of being able to articulate, as Shannon has just done for us, sort of what we're thinking and feeling, and putting it out into a space where we can look at it, is really important. And so that idea of communication, whether it's just with ourselves or with someone else, is really the foundational idea here. And it's going to have implications for how we can build empathetic spaces for our students. And we're going to get to that in just a moment. So how can we formulate that? Well, Parker Palmer gives us an answer to that, which is this process of naming, claiming, and aiming. We need a little fairy to ring the bell. So I'm just going to walk us really quickly here, just through the format, and then Shannon and I are going to break it down in terms of her scenario. So the first piece is this idea of naming. So as Shannon did, what am I feeling in this moment? Giving it a word, or as Hamlet would say, a local habitation and a name. And we need to think about that in terms not just about sort of what's going on in our heads, but also what's going on inside our bodies as well. Because how we're feeling physically, there's a feedback there in terms of how we're thinking and how we're understanding our moment. We can then move to this notion of claiming. So what is going on in that response? So how can we dig into that and explore what's going on there? What values and self-conceptions are operating that are producing these responses? And finally, how can we mine that, to use Parker Palmer's language, how can we mine that for information that we can use to help us to make choices as we move forward? So let's just break that down a little bit. Okay, so the first one, the idea of naming, right? So what am I feeling in this difficult moment, and paying attention to the physical, the mental, and the emotional. And one of the key pieces here is something that Parker mentions, in this quotation, which is that it's not about judging what you're feeling, right? So painful feelings are not signs of personal weakness, sources of shame, or irrelevant to the complex challenges of knowing, working, and living, right? So this is not a space where you're like, oh, I'm so stupid for being angry about this, right? It's just a moment where we can say, this is what I'm feeling, this is what I'm thinking, and putting it out there into that space of communication. So Shannon, can you sort of go back to your scenario and tell us just really briefly, what in that moment, what were you feeling physically, mentally, and emotionally?
Exhausted, isolated, I suppose, when we were first talking about it. I don't usually feel old, but I was feeling old, as if my moment had passed me by, and really not in control. So that's
okay, good. And can you just talk, like, how did that actually go in your body? Like, how did you feel that in your body? So exhausted is one way, but like, what does old feel like, or what does out of control feel like in your physical self?
Yeah, that feeling of anxiety manifesting itself in a desire to clean the basement instead of do something that would actually address the problem at hand, running off in all directions.
Right. Yeah. Oh, I wish I had that response, because my house would be so much cleaner than it is right now. Okay, so now we've got some words that we can use, right? Exhausted, out of control, anxious, right? That sort of sense of pounding, that fight or flight feeling that you get, like I have to do something in this moment, but I can't. So you sort of end up directing it in all these weird places, as I'm doing right now. Right. So we've got some words there. So let's think about what that might look like if we try to claim those feelings. What's going on underneath that? So, ring.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so I'm just going to ask Jennifer. I almost called you Jennifer again. So weird. Jessica, your name is on the screen even. Oh my gosh. Could you just describe this photograph, what's going on? Jessica is populated our PowerPoint with all of the beautiful pictures that you're seeing. And there's so much logic and thought that goes into them. Can you just talk about how this image relates to the idea of the claim process?
Sure. So the quotation here was really, for me, something that illuminated some of the discomfort that I've been experiencing over the time of the global pandemic, to tell the difference between the emotions that illumine our environment and those that reveal our own shadows, and that play with light and shadow, and that play with what's in our foreground and yet what's in the background, animating it. This is a picture of my two tiny humans, who are naked little wood nymphs dancing in the rays of sunshine. I was taking a picture of my peonies in that foreground, illuminated by that beam of light, but in the background and animating all of my thinking has been my children, and my children playing and exploring while I work full time. So, you know, when everything shut down March 13th, a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old came home and stayed home. And how do you do that? How do you manage that discomfort? But how do you illuminate some of those discomforts to make something beautiful? So this is a photo of my naked babies.
Thank you. I love that description. That makes me so happy. And that's so your children too, which is great. So when we're thinking then about this process of claiming, we want to think about sort of what's going on in the inside, right? What do I bring to that particular uncomfortable moment that is shaping my responses? And what are the conditions that are operating around me that are shaping my responses? Neither one is good or bad or better or worse, but they ask us to think about different kinds of solutions, or to go down different paths. And then we can also think about, okay, well, what are the consequences for me and for the people around me or the environment around me of what I'm bringing into that situation? So Shannon, could you talk a little bit about sort of what was going on there in terms of those questions?
Yeah, as we were thinking about that idea of the outer reality, well, obviously the world is broken. So that's the outer reality in which I find myself. And the inner reality, the more I thought about this with you two, the more interesting it was that it really highlighted a lot of the contradictions that I have to deal with in my teachings. So, for example, that I do believe in the importance of failure, and I don't want to fail. And I do believe that messiness and inefficiency are essential to real deep learning, and I want everything to be in control at the same time. And I always tell myself as I walk into a classroom that I'm the least important person in that classroom, but I want to be really good at it. So all of those contradictions I know I'm bringing to this moment of feeling as if I'm incompetent and I can't figure things out.
Right. And so there's like this feeling of contradiction again as well, right? Which maps on quite nicely to that fight or flight kind of thing that sends you to clean your basement, right? Is how do you deal or live in those moments of contradiction becomes really interesting and challenging, right? Because it divides us up in all of these different ways and forces us to confront all kinds of weird complicities, right? Which is, it's like, I just have to get this done, right? At the same time. So what do you think then, I'm gonna just give a little bit of a frame here, and I'm gonna ask you this question about the consequences of this response. So one of the things that Parker Palmer talks about, he has a chapter on fear, and he says that there's two kinds of fear. There's the kinds of fear that make us impervious to the world, right? That in those moments of challenge or discomfort or fear, we're just like, no, I cannot, I'm not going to engage with this. Or don't tell me I'm wrong, I can't handle that, or, those kinds of moments. But then there's other kinds of fears that, or perhaps it's more of a path to a place where fears can make you porous, where they actually make you open up to possibilities or other people. I think that pretty much describes the COVID situation in a nutshell, right? Is that we are sort of cycling through or coming up against these kinds of competing ways of thinking about those discomforts, right? Some that close us off and some that break us open, to use his words that Jessica talked about in her University Affairs article last week, which was beautiful. So, so Shannon, for you, can you kind of think about that path? So where were you, on that day that we were talking? Where are you now? How does that response influence you? What are the consequences of that, do you think?
Well, at the time, the potential consequences of that moment, that feeling was that I was not only porous but paralyzed, right? That I really had no idea where to go next, and that was, that was a very uncomfortable feeling. And I love that metaphor you use of the porous and the impervious. So I need to stop being impervious and need to. I have tried to move towards the porous.
Mm-hmm, right. Which I think the fact that you're here doing this right now is a great element of the porous, right? In that regard, right? That's sort of, okay, let's have this conversation about this horrible thing that I'm sort of struggling with, right?
And although we talked this through before, I'm surprised at how embarrassed I'm feeling. That I almost didn't expect. So that's one of these other sorts of things. Just talking about it is embarrassing for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and just for full disclosure, like we gave Shannon the ripcord, right? We can do something else, right? Like half an hour ago we had this conversation, and Shannon said, "Nope, I want to do this," right? So I think that is great, right? That again, that's that sort of act of courage, right? To come into the space and sort of break this down. Which for me, I find it easier if I have some questions to follow or a path to follow. And it kind of keeps me moving along that path through my own discomfort. So good. So let's move on to the next one. I'm conscious of our time. So keeping in mind that we're just kind of introducing these things. We're not going to break everything down in all of its spaces. So we were going to have a little moment here. For you to return to your free write, and we're just going to take just 2 minutes. We're not going to take a lot of time, and to ask you to think about, and maybe we can back up to the claim screen while we're doing this, to have you to think a little bit about your scenario and to see if you can respond to these questions for yourself, for your own space, but just for a couple of minutes, just to start to pin it down to your own experience. So starting now, let's do that. Okay, we're going to, oh, there's my dog. We're going to just finish up your thought and then we'll come back. Okay. Thank you. This is Luna. She's convalescing, so she's camping out with me today. Okay, so let's see if we can move on then to the next step. Thank you. And so this is the aiming piece. This is where we can sort of mine that experience, that reflection that we've done, to think about what can it tell us about strategies that we might engage with or implement or try or even just think about as we move forward. So this is the second piece of that long quotation from Palmer, where he says, where he asks, we need to ask ourselves if those feelings and thoughts that we've been working with have consequences for action, and if so, to explore them for clues to strategies for social change. So we can ask ourselves, what's something that I could change in my own orientation toward the problem? What's something that needs to change in the environment around me that would help me to produce a space that's better for my own learning and well-being and so on. And one of the ways that I sort of think about that to operationalize it, I'm a learning outcomes kind of thinker, so I like to have verbs. And so in the Google Doc, I put up a sample sort of reflection path. So I just went through a scenario, and what I came up with there was like, what do I really feel I have to fight for that I'm not willing to give up? What could I adapt and what could I let go in this moment? So we're going to actually get you to do this work, but I'm going to give Shannon a word here. So Shannon, can you just give us like one thing for each of those categories just quickly, and then we'll get people to brainstorm.
Yeah, in the environment, I suppose what I've been trying to do is to come up with a syllabus to work through. I know how to make up a syllabus. So I've made up a syllabus for myself, a structure to try to figure out what to do before September. And one of the things I did first was to email my students, just to let them know what will be my new mantra, which is, we will figure it out. Things will go wrong, but we'll figure it out. And for Myself, I guess it's knowing that I'm going to continue to struggle. I'm going to have some bad days. But I'll use my mantra on myself. I'll figure it out. I'll work it through. So recognizing where that anxiety's come from is really helpful. But then moving it towards my syllabus, focusing it outwards towards my students, and then finding my team, talking to you two, talking to Gerald, who's elsewhere on here, talking to Anne and Greg, who are my colleagues who are also on here. So yeah, finding my team to talk to so that I'm not isolated.
Right, excellent, good, excellent. And the idea of telling your students your mantra and then telling yourself that mantra brings us like a beautiful segue to our next stage of this process. There we go. And this is the other piece of the doer quotation from which we began. So the first piece is that process of putting the situation sort of into a communicative space where we can talk to ourselves or talk to others about them. And then he says one has to assimilate imaginatively something of another's experience in order to tell him or they intelligently of one's own experience. And so what he's mapping here is this relationship between formulating, articulating, and communicating, which at its heart, particularly if you look at this quotation through the lens of Parker Palmer, is about empathy, right? So that statement that Shannon made about telling her students, we're going to work it out, and then having to tell herself, I'm going to work it out, sort of points to the kind of bridges that can be built through this process. And one of the things that we'd like to do is to figure out how we can create that empathetic connection between ourselves and our own experience, and what can we learn about our students and their experience through this act of reflection and connection. So Shannon has done, the first part of that, right, which is to articulate the situation, to work it through, to open it up into that communicative space, and then as her strategy suggests, then to think about how that might work and what insights we can gain from that about how our students might also be feeling in these moments. So I'm going to hand it off to Jessica. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I think that's one of the, that's the step of how do you make visible your own discomfort? How do you understand the light and shadow? How do you claim it and then aim it with that deep empathy, with that willingness to be broken open rather than being broken apart? And one of the things that we've talked about a lot in our chats daily is if we're feeling this sense of anxiety and groundlessness, what are our students feeling? We're all sharing a sense of being exposed in our radical unknowing. And thank you, Shannon, for that, exposing yourself. I think I was watching the chat and watching everybody saying, oh, thank you for naming that and making that visible. I'm going through that process myself. I'm glad I'm not the only one. Students are also feeling exposed. We're unsure of our roles in the context of this rapid change, right? We are used to, as faculty, being sort of these arbiters or of authority in some way, or at least mastery of our content and maybe our classroom space. And that's been really disrupted, but it has been for students as they occupy position of learner alongside of us, that we're all experiencing this deep cognitive overload, that we have Zoom fatigue, that we're on the COVID coaster together in ways that we're not quite sure how we're going to end up. And we're experiencing that real clash of divergent ways of knowing and of being and of practicing, all under these weights of expectations. And so one of the things that I think has really helped me frame my own experience is to remember myself, is to remember our students. And I'm going to read this quotation because it is just a beautiful touchstone for us if we're feeling like we're kind of spinning out. It's this wonderful reassurance that that I find really, really helpful. But Parker Palmer says, when I forget my own inner multiplicity and my own long and continuing journey towards selfhood, my expectations of students become excessive and unreal. If I can remember the inner pluralism of my own soul and the slow pace of my own self-emergence, I will be better able to serve the pluralism among my students at the pace of their young lives. So by remembering ourselves, we remember our students. And I think that's such an incredible lens through which to look through the world. I noticed that one of my favorite thought partners at Bishop, Scott Stoddard, is on the call. And he and I have spent Monday and Tuesday night in focus groups with 25 Bishop students each night. And we have asked them if they could collaborate to create their ideal classroom for fall 2020, what would it look like? And Scott and I, along with our student guide, Georges Philippe, have been absolutely overwhelmed by the grace and the generosity and the clarity of these students and their deep vulnerability about being able to name their discomfort, to be able to model that overload and to not be ashamed of it. And I think that connecting with students is one of our therapies too, right? Is to go into that ecosystem and to talk about what is lost and what is gained in this new COVID context. Can we ding to the next slide? Thank you. So connecting to our students, connecting to experiences, understanding, in some ways, empathy is not recognizing that everyone is feeling the same thing, but recognizing that people are experiencing things and discomfort. And there's this great meme that was circulating around the internet a couple weeks ago that says, we're all in the same storm, but we're in different boats. And I think that's really important, right? There are many different layers of accessibility and access. There are precarious and marginalized communities who are disproportionately affected. We need to be able to practice that deep empathy as we aim our knowledge, as we try to create frameworks for a better and more inclusive and just post-secondary education system. And so that remembering from my own experience that students too are afraid, I think is a really important reminder. And we're going to get you to do some breakout work right now and to think about these thought prompts about what it does to imagine the experience of our students as a path forward, as a way to prepare, as Shannon sets up a syllabus for, like, how do you get to fall 2020 and beyond? How do you imagine yourself doing this kind of work? I'd like you to be able to sort of talk this through with your smaller groups. So can we ding? Thank you. We're going to use the breakout feature of Zoom. We're going to put you into groups of about 5. We have created a Google Doc that is in the chat. Heather Carroll, lovely, lovely human, is putting it in the chat just to remind you. So you can open that up and use that. The thought prompts are there for you. So you can go through that and you can write some of your reflections if you feel comfortable, if you feel that that is a safe space to respond to those, and then we'll bring you back in 10 minutes. So the magical breakout Zoom fairy is going to wave their wand now. I'm just going to give everyone 1 second to just get back into this main sort of space, and then Shannon will give us the PowerPoint back up. Welcome back. I'm conscious of time, so I want to make sure that we are releasing you at 3 o'clock at our allotted time. But I did want to just open the floor up to anybody who wanted to share the conversations that they had in their breakout group. So one or maybe 2 comments before we move towards hopeful conclusions. Anybody feeling brave, wanting to share some of the, maybe an insight or a light bulb moment from conversations?
I'd be happy to if you'd like, Jessica.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Hannah Solinsky, and I'm from the University of the Fraser Valley out in British Columbia. One of the things that we talked about was flexibility and receiving feedback throughout the semester from students to alter the trajectory of the course to suit their needs as we go along, so that we're not married to that original syllabus and we can ebb and flow with them. And to be clear about that right from the beginning so that we all go through the process together. And to make sure to connect with them in person early. They're very fearful that they won't have those connections with their instructors. They don't know how to do online office hours. To establish that early and really get their engagement and make that connection with them straight away.
You've just given us a list of excellent ways to connect both with values, but also anchoring it in practice, right? You've said, okay, if everybody is open to transformation, that we're going to be responsive and nimble, that we're going to adapt and evolve together, that we're going to live into these messy journeys, and we're going to actually build in both the feedback loops there, but also that human connection, right? To connect. I think Sean Michael Morris said in a recent blog, to teach through the screen, not to the screen, right? How do you get to this three-dimensional holistic learning space and connect with them in individualized and human ways? Thank you so much, Hannah. That's really, really lovely. Would anybody else like to share one insight or flash of knowledge or strategy that they used to aim some of their discomfort with students? I see Kathy from the University of Toronto Scarborough has raised her hand. Kathy, would you like to share?
Sure, I'll share a quick thing from our group. So one of the things that came up for us, for a couple of us, was the challenge of not being able to see the people, and not just not being able to see them, but that we haven't ever met them in person. And that relates both to new faculty members who are walking into a new job and have never actually met their colleagues, and those of us who are teaching, walking into classes where in March, at least we had them in person, and then it was a transition, but now we're starting from scratch without knowing them. And a couple of notes we had about things that might tell us about students was trying to give them lots of information about how to learn online, because we need lots of information about how to teach online, and be willing to share our own discomfort while trying to be positive about the changes as much as it's possible to be positive in this environment.
No, thank you, Kathy. And I think you point out a really important piece there, which is if you're going to create classrooms as relationship-rich environments, right? They're based on relationships, and they're based on trust and mutual appreciation and clear expectations. It's really hard to do that if you haven't connected yet. And I love that you flagged, especially junior faculty members who are coming in who are just overwhelmed and looking for. I think Magdalene said in the chat, finding your team. Like, you got to find your team and find that ecosystem and double down on that collaboration if we're going to make it through this deep messiness and discomfort. And as you say, Kathy, find some light, find some opportunity, find some benefit here. Thank you. So I'd like to invite my my collaborators, Lisa and Shannon. Lisa first, just to give one final insight or something that struck you in the conversations that we had with our group in the chat. Just something, a takeaway from the session.
I think that I don't like feelings. My Latin motto is non ut motus, which means I don't like feelings. And so this is really challenging for me. But I like to be able to keep in my mind that there is valuable information in my own responses that I can use to make things better for myself and for students. And even when I'm in the midst of those things, remembering that I can fire off a text to Jessica and Shannon and say, I'm so mad about this, or I'm freaking out about this, and to be able to talk through that and walk my way through so I can get from being impervious to porous, I think is one of the most valuable things, to recognize that I've got information there. I might not be in that moment ready to mine it and use it, but the more reflection that I do and that I start writing things down and having those communicative moments, that is going to save me this year. Yeah.
Thank you, Lisa. And Shannon, over to you. Final thought or insight?
Yeah, well, I'm feeling very hopeful at the at the end of this. Jessica and Lisa and I work on critical hope, and I use that phrase advisedly. We work on it. And one of the things that struck us is that the more we think about hope and read about it and theorize it and think how it's going to play out in action, the more hopeful we get. And one of the reasons that this is hopeful for me is that in preparing with Lisa and Jessica and in listening to the chat and in having this conversation, I see that I'm not alone. My colleagues are going through very similar things, and it's hopeful because we can work together. And I'm really excited about turning outward to focus on my students, and as Lisa always says, to make them true partners in the year ahead, and also hopeful to focus on how we can actually come out of this with some things that are better than they were before, avoiding the toxic positivity that Jessica outlined so well, but trying to make sure that our direction ends up ends up the right one in the end. So yeah, I'll end hopefully and pass it on to Jessica.
Thank you so much. And I think as we were building this session and we were thinking about, this session is in fact a way that we're aiming our discomfort, right? We're sharing, we're reaching out to this community and working through it together and being vulnerable. And one of the questions that we had when we were designing this is, what would be the most helpful? And we have this discussion about how simple that question is, but how difficult it is when you're struggling to even be able to articulate what is helpful, right? What you can actually do when you don't have the language necessarily to even know how to ask for help. And so we're sort of looking at those tensions between helpful and hopeful, and making sure we sort of model that vulnerability, but really exercise that radical reflective work, right? What are we doing? What are we thinking? How are we thinking about power relations? How are we becoming learners? How are we interrogating our authority and our narratives of struggle? And so I think that has been to really clearly articulated. Thank you. In the chat, we're going to make sure, Denise, to download that chat if you can for us, to continue those conversations. We're going to share that Google Doc with you. So Magdalene, if you're looking for a team, you've got us, we're here. And if you're interested in continuing these conversations, as Lisa said, this is just a starter. This is just a sort of tease about what the framework could look like, but then anchoring it in practice is a whole other kettle of fish. So if you want to continue those conversations, we're really happy to connect with you and create a community of practice around this. So thank you so much to my collaborators, Lisa and Shannon, for their generous and beautiful minds, and to Erica and to Denise and everybody at STLHE. I'm so amazed by this institution, that when other people put things on hold and ceased operations, STLHE doubled down on webinars and connecting and building community. And I think that is incredible and a real testament to the vision and values of this organization that I'm lucky to be a member of. So thank you, everybody. Go into the world, see how you can name your discomfort and claim it and embody it, and then aim it in productive and generative ways. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you in virtual and real spaces in the future.